First off, I would like to thank you for tuning in today at this very sacred and special time of year. I'm referring, of course, to Shark Week on the Discovery Channel, which begins tonight with Mike Tyson versus Jaws Rumble on the Reef. Set your DVRs. As some of you already know, Shark Week is right up there with Holy Week in terms of sanctity, at least in my family. And now this is the second year since I've been here at Bethlehem that the text of Jesus walking on the water coincides with Shark Week, which I can only hope is this little inside joke amongst the people who set the lectionary texts. But I probably am just dreaming. Like, I can hope though, right? And so it was with images of air jaws running through my head that I read this week's story. Air jaws being where the sharks launch their entire body out of the water in a full breach. And all I could think was, thank goodness the Sea of Galilee is fresh water. Now, today's story comes immediately on the heels of the one that we heard last week, where Jesus is in that deserted place with a huge crowd, and he fed all of them with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, the reason that Jesus found himself in this deserted place was not by chance. No, he had just received word that King Herod had executed John the Baptist. He had been trying to get away, to find space and time to mourn that loss. But the crowds had followed him, and he had compassion on them. He healed their sick and he fed them. But now that that was over, Jesus sends the disciples away. He sends the crowds away. He goes up on the mountain to pray. He took time to go and be alone, to sit in stillness and silence, or possibly to pace and yell and maybe even let out a few choice, not appropriate for church words. We don't really know what his private prayer time was like, but we do know that he made time for it. Back in March, when this pandemic was newly underway, many of us, myself included, thought that if we could just push through, tough it out, that we could rest when we got to the other side, when all of this was over. Sadly, it eventually became clear that finish line that we were all hoping for kept moving further and further out of reach. So much so that some days it wasn't even in sight at all. And we found that the whole white knuckle your way through it mentality just isn't sustainable in this reality. That we need to find time and space to be alone, to take deep, measured breaths as opposed to panicked gasps, to find time and space to nurture our relationship with God, to intentionally engage in prayerful activity. Now, I do not at all believe that God only comes to us in stillness, silence, and solitude. Those of you with young children at home might not even remember what those things are like. Nor do I want to prescribe what your prayer time should look like, what activities you should engage in as you are communing with the divine. I simply want to say that even Jesus took time to pray. So if you have been trying to just power through life since March, if you've been ignoring all of your physical and spiritual check engine lights, I'd invite you to pull off to the side of the road, even for just a few moments, to attend to yourself. Take time to talk with God. Share your fears, your concerns, your deepest worries, maybe even a few choice, not appropriate for church words. Share your joys, the unforeseen bright spots that have been brought on by this pandemic, the ways that you feel blessed or burdened or simply bored. Share it with God. Let it go and see what that does. My body so often feels like this clenched fist, but when I take time to pray, I gradually feel the fingers releasing themselves. Take that time, whatever it might look like for you. Okay, now that the spiritual health PSA is over, back to our regularly scheduled gospel reading. The story of Jesus walking on water appears in 3 out of the 4 gospels, with Luke being the only one to leave it out. But the version that we heard today from Matthew is the only one to include this exchange with Peter. The disciples are out on a ship and they are battling a great storm when out of nowhere they see Jesus walking toward them across the waves. Now, at first they're terrified. They think it's a ghost, but Jesus calls out to them saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answers him, "Lord, if it is you, then command me to come to you on the water." So Jesus says, "Sure, why not?" Peter steps out onto the surface of the water, and what do you know, but he's actually doing it. He is walking on the water too. But then the wind and the waves distract him, and he becomes afraid, and he starts to sink. He calls out, "Jesus, Lord, save me." Jesus reaches out his hand to steady him and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And then they both get back into the boat. Now, first things first, I want you to notice who it was that initiated this whole sequence, because it wasn't Jesus. Peter, ever the eager beaver, ever the kid sitting in the front row, frantically raising their hand, the Hermione Granger of disciples, if you will, minus the smarts. Peter comes up with this idea all on his own. Now, a less than careful reading of this text could leave you with the impression that it was Jesus who wanted to test Peter's faith by inviting him to walk on the waves, but that is not the case. Peter is the driving force behind this whole sequence. In one of the commentaries that I read in preparation for this week, theologian Amy Hunter told a story of a college classmate of hers who defined faith as stepping out of airplanes, knowing that God will catch you. Now, her response to this understanding of faith was that surely God has better things to do than catch folks stupid enough to be stepping out of airplanes. But all joking aside, this story and stories like this can lead us down dangerous paths to some very bad theology. Theology that would tell us that if our faith is strong enough, nothing bad will ever happen to us. Theology that would tell us that when something bad does happen to us, it's because our faith wasn't strong enough. This way of thinking would have us believe that when we experience hardships, it is God testing us, testing our faith to see if it is strong enough, to see if we are strong enough. And when things don't work out as we had hoped, it's because we failed to be steadfast and faithful enough to endure it. Let me say this now with clarity and certainty. The hardships that you have experienced in life are not as a result of you not having enough faith. The heartbreaks, the tragedies and pain that you have endured were not sent by God to test your faith, nor are they any reflection on the strength of your faith. That's not how faith works. Nor is faith about reckless self-endangerment. God is not asking us to step out of airplanes or step onto the surface of wind-blown and stormy seas to prove our faith. This is a dangerous way of thinking about our relationship with God, because it can cause us to hold ourselves responsible for things that are entirely outside of our control. It can also lead us into reckless behavior aimed at proving our faith to God or to ourselves or to one another. This is the type of thinking that has led to those soundbite interviews that I'm sure you've seen on TV of churchgoers claiming that they don't need to wear a mask because they have been saved by Jesus and that God will protect them. It reminds me of that old story of a man standing on the roof of his house in a flood. Now first a man in a canoe comes by and offers to help, but he turns him away because he is sure that God will save him. He does the same thing with a woman on a jet ski and then a rescue helicopter. He turns them away because he knows that God will save him. And when he gets to heaven, he angrily approaches God, asking God, "Why didn't you rescue me?" Only to be told by God, "I sent you a canoe and a jet ski and a helicopter." I feel like we might need a new version. "I sent you medical experts, gave you masks, and told you about social distancing." Now, there is another way to see all of this. And rather than being something that must be tested or proven, we can see faith as something that God has given to us as a gift to help guide us through the hardships that we face. That God stands with us, upholding and accompanying us as we face all that life throws our way. That the gift of faith is something that God promises to nurture and care for, not test or try to tear down. And that faith isn't some commodity that we're meant to collect or hoard, trying to have the biggest faith score out of all the members of our congregation. But if that's the case, then what is up with Jesus' response to Peter? You of little faith, why did you doubt? Many have viewed Jesus' words as a rebuke, as a judgment of Peter and his pitifully small faith. But just a few chapters later, Jesus says that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. And we all know how powerful a little mustard seed is. If not, be sure to go back and check out my sermon from 2 weeks ago. Now this turns Jesus' words from a rebuke into the loving words of a supportive friend. Instead of you of little faith, it's more like, oh man, you had it. You were doing it. Why did you stop? He goes from being judgy and critical to being a cheerleader. Someone on our side, by our side, cheering us on, wanting us to succeed, but being there to offer a hand when we stumble. I've talked a lot today about what faith isn't, and in part that's because it's a lot easier than describing what faith is. Luckily, others much wiser than I have tried their hand at defining it. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. Now, putting aside the fact that many days lately I feel like I can't even see my own feet, let alone the rest of the staircase, I really like this definition. You know, we take those first steps because we trust that the rest of the staircase lies just around the corner. We trust that the builder of this house wouldn't have quit halfway through the staircase or built a staircase to nowhere. Whether we know that builder or not, we have entered into a relationship with them the second that we step on that first stair. So faith is about that relationship of trust. And the same is true with God. Faith is first and foremost about having a relationship with God. It's about having trust and hope that God will be with us, not as tester or arbiter, but as cheerleader and supporter. Peter was able to step out of that boat, not as a dangerous attempt to prove himself or because God demanded this display of faith, but because he had a relationship with Jesus. He knew that with Jesus, the impossible was achievable, and that Jesus would be there for him should he stumble or falter. And the same is true for us. So how do we nurture and care for our faith? Well, one of the ways is through prayer, through active engagement in our relationship with the divine in whatever form that might look like for you. Another is through worship. Whether it be in person or online, worship reminds us that faith is strengthened when it is lived out in the midst of community. We hear the stories of our faith, the impossible, unbelievable, awe-inspiring stories that led those first people to believe, that planted seeds of faith the size of mustard seeds in our hearts. We hear stories of God's steadfast love, of a God who keeps promises, a God who upholds covenants, a God who inspires trust, that in turn nurtures faith. And finally, we nurture it by looking for God's activity in the world. We point it out to one another, and we live it out for one another. Because when we do that, faith stops being something that must be proven or earned or accumulated, and it becomes something to steady and guide us, giving us something to give us courage to take that next step, though darkness shrouds our view, though the staircase twists and turns out of sight. Faith means that we live knowing that no matter what we face, we do not face it